Ceann Comhairle. Minister, I'm sure you will agree that the vast majority of Irish people are law-abiding citizens. The fact that with less than 3 days to go, that more than 1 million people have yet to pay the household charge is a measure of the shambles that the government has made of this whole affair. Since the government forced through the charge in its present form last December, the communication strategy and political handling of this tax has been a disaster. Even government ministers have publicly conceded that mistakes have been made. Minister Phil Hogan has apologised in private to his Fine Gael parliamentary party colleagues, but not in public to the Irish people. You refused point blank to allow a waiver for people who have a genuine inability to pay.
Did you miss the meeting, Anthony?
You refused point blank to allow a waiver for people who have a genuine inability to pay. Since then, people...
You're welcome home from Australia.
If I may, Ceann Comhairle.
Minister, please.
Welcome back.
Minister.
If I may, Ceann Comhairle.
Minister, please. Sorry, Deputy, please proceed.
You weren't at home to pay it. He called in to give you the €100 and you weren't.
If I may.
Deputy Julie.
Please.
Would you please? Thank you.
My time will be added.
Would you please? Thank you.
If I may, Ceann Comhairle. You refuse point blank to allow a waiver for people who have a genuine inability to pay. Since then, people have been given the wrong information, they have been threatened, and genuine concerns have been dismissed out of hand. Government ministers have taken to the airwaves, publicly contradicting each other about the role of An Post. People have been threatened that a council official will knock on their door to collect a tax, and that income tax will rise if the charge is not collected. We now have confirmation from Active Retirement Ireland and others that fraudsters are knocking on the doors of vulnerable elderly people throughout this country looking for the €100 charge, all because of the government's threat. The deadline for paying this charge by instalment passed at the end of February, at a time when the awareness of the charge was much less than it is today. Minister, there are many thousands of ordinary Irish people who simply do not have access to €100 between now and Saturday night. Isn't it the case?
Thank you.
Isn't it the case that the only thing preventing people being allowed extra time to pay this charge is the stubborn political pride of Minister Hogan and this government? Are you really going to force fines and penalties on over 1 million ordinary Irish people? Minister, Irish people are reasonable and fair-minded. Will you take the heat out of this situation? Extend the deadline for the payment of this charge, allow people to pay through their local post office and allow them to pay by instalments in accordance with the means that they have.
Minister.
The deputy opposite is his party's spokesperson on finance, so he is uniquely well placed to understand the economic situation this country is faced with. He also understands that we are dependent to fund day-to-day services on an arrangement entered into by the previous administration with the Troika. Under that agreement, we are obliged this year to have a household charge. We will migrate to a more refined household charge for next year. That work is already underway. But we are obliged to have the money this year. Now, I think that there's probably, because of the focus and controversy, there's probably not a household in the country that is unaware that this charge is due. They know there's 3 ways in which the charge can be and should be paid by the deadline of Saturday. 500,000 households have already paid. And I would ask deputies on all sides of the House not to play party politics with this. This is part of the survival strategy for this country. There is a requirement for local government to fund its normal services for €160 million to be raised. The local government fund requires the household charge to meet €160 million this year. And wherever there is a shortfall in that, whenever there is a deputy in this House or somebody who is obliged to pay who doesn't pay, that will impact upon the quality of local services. So I would ask deputies, I would ask Matty, I would ask I would ask deputies in this House. I would ask deputies in this House to accept that there is a legal requirement on households to pay €100. I know that it is an imposition. I know the pressure that households are under. But the deputy opposite knows full well the economic catastrophe that this government inherited, and we need to broaden the tax base beyond the narrow focus on taxing income alone, to restore a solid income base to ensure that local services and ordinary services are continued to be provided for the people who need them.
Thank you.
Minister, you acknowledge the need to broaden the tax base. Implicit in that is acceptance by this government that this has to be done. You consistently highlight your negotiating skills with the EU and the IMF. At no stage has this government sought to renegotiate the household charge or property tax. You should be honest enough with the Irish people and at least acknowledge that fact. I am all too well aware of the situation with the National Finances Minister, and the important thing for the national finances is that the 160 million that is pencilled into the budget from the household charge is collected over the course of 2012. Over the course of 2012, Minister, not by midnight on Saturday night. And by imposing the strict terms and conditions in the manner in which you have done, you are placing enormous pressure on and stress on ordinary Irish families, many of whom simply do not have access to €100 between now and midnight Saturday night. And are you really going to impose fines and penalties on over 1 million people if they cannot genuinely come up with €100 between now and Saturday night? Minister, you need to acknowledge that you have not managed to bring the people with you on this one.
Thank you.
And for once, eat some humble pie politically. You have already acknowledged mistakes in the budget in respect of cuts to people with profound disabilities. Acknowledge that the way this has been handled has also been a mistake. Extend the deadline, give people who genuinely want to pay an opportunity to do so, and extend the deadline and allow them to do so by instalments.
Make 3 points to the Deputy. First, in relation to, I listened to deputies, including on this morning's radio, who indicate they are in favour of a property tax, just not this one. And I know that whatever property tax is devised, it will be opposed by people for base political reasons. I know that. I'll make 3 points. One, the Deputy's party agreed with the Troika to have a site valuation tax. This is the first step in having that. It is a flat rate tax. It needs to be nuanced, and we're working on it. It couldn't be done in any other way this year. Secondly, the Deputy talks about it being done in the course of this year. Local authorities need certainty in their funding. There's no point in telling them their allocation. There's no point in telling them. There is no point in telling them. We know, Councillor.
Listen, we live in a parliamentary democracy. I get complaints. Now, Deputy, you'll take a walk here, you're not careful.
There are deputies.
Excuse me, Deputy. Excuse me, Deputy. Please don't speak to the chair like that. Well, listen, I want to tell you, I get complaints every single morning about the behaviour in this chamber from people who are viewing this proceedings in this House, and nobody who shouts and roars is impressing anybody. I ask people to allow people to have their say, and others can speak. Thank you.
Count Corla, I know that there are deputies opposite who will support no tax, support no charge, support no cut. It's the Darby O'Gill economics that the people won't be fooled by. They want this economy to recover, and they know the path to recovery is a hard path, and they won't be fooled by people pretending that you can fund local government or anybody else with magic money. The final point, as I said, is we need certainty in relation to this funding. I would ask people, and I'd ask everybody in this House, those who are obliged to pay this household charge, to use the mechanisms that are there between now and Saturday to pay the charge. in solidarity with the 500,000 households, many of whom are not in a great position, but know their duty is to pay the charge. I would ask people to do it.
Deputy Mary Lou MacDonald, please. Thank you. Thank you. If you want to have a conversation with each other, please go outside the chamber. I've called on Deputy MacDonald. Thank you.
Minister, your colleague Joan Burton has called on government to review contact with Mr Denis O'Brien, and I believe that Minister Lucinda Creighton shares those concerns. In fact, she was critical of his attendance at the Global Irish Economic Forum last October. Seems to me that the Taoiseach takes an entirely different view, beaming as he was from a photograph with the same individual. So can I ask you, Minister, to set out your position on this matter and the position of government?
Let me say that from my own personal perspective, I think there is a consequence, and should be a consequence, for those well-known people or not against whom adverse findings are adduced by a tribunal of inquiry. That's my view, and I think it's an important point to bear in mind. In relation to the specific point the Deputy raised, the Taoiseach was invited, didn't issue invitations. He was invited to a particular function. Others were also invited. None of us can control the people that are photographed with us. In relation to the invitation to the Global Forum, the invitations that went out replicated those that were invited to the first forum, and that's what happened. There were adverse comments in relation to the attendance.
Sorry, would you please? There
were adverse comments, Ceann Comhairle, in relation to the attendance of Mr O'Brien, and we don't have to reflect on that. We don't have to reflect on that. I saw the glad handling of the former leader of Fianna Fáil at a party conference. We'll see who now shuns them. We all have to make personal decisions, and the government has to make its decisions in relation to any individual against whom adverse findings are made by a tribunal established by this House. And I agree with the Deputy in that regard.
Well, that answer isn't clear at all. You say that there should be consequences, for people against whom adverse findings are made. You say that the government has to take a decision. What is that decision? It strikes me, after a week spent debating Mahon, that the government is rather ambivalent or confused, or maybe even compromised in terms of its position around genuine consequences and genuine reform. So tell us very clearly, what's the government view of contact with Mr O'Brien? Or do you have a division on this matter? And can I say furthermore that the fiasco around Phil Hogan, not just around the household charge, but shutting down legitimate inquiries into planning issues across local authorities,
we can't go into a separate...
is a further...
Deputy.
Ambivalence.
We only can leave with one topic. You're replying, you have a minute and you're over time.
So the question is, what's the position? Tell us plainly, what is the position of government in respect of Mr Denis O'Brien?
Let me first answer the first question you talk about, our reaction to the Mahon Tribunal.
Sorry, we won't. That's a separate issue entirely. We're talking about Mr O'Brien, full stop.
Well, I understood it was the adverse findings in relation to the Moriarty Tribunal and the Mahon Tribunal, and how we deal with people against whom adverse findings have been made. But I will obviously...
You understand my position?
I do indeed, Ceann Comhairle. But when I hear a scattergun of questions, we'd like to answer them. I've said to you the view I've outlined in relation to Mr O'Brien, and my view in relation to anybody against whom serious adverse findings have been arrived at by a tribunal of inquiry. That is the view. I have to tell you honestly, we haven't discussed a list of people to be shunned, if that's what you're asking for, at Cabinet. But that hasn't arisen. But if issues like this, in terms of future invitations are to be issued, I'm sure those matters will be discussed at Cabinet.
Thank you. Deputy Finian McGrath, thank you.
Concorda.
Sorry, please, would you... If this behaviour doesn't cease, I'm going to suspend the sitting. I would ask the ministers in particular to show example. I'm serious. I'm going to suspend the sitting if this behaviour continues on both sides. Thank you, Deputy Finian McGrath. And you stay quiet, please. Thank you.
Concorda, if I may. Sorry,
Concorda,
if I can bring the chamber back to a very serious issue.
Thank you.
A number of weeks ago on the Dáil, I raised the very important and serious issue of gangland crime and crime generally, and the huge negative impact in our country and throughout communities. Since then, we have seen the terrible plight of Steve Collins and his family having to flee the country following the horrific murder of his son Ryan as a consequence of gangland criminals. And we've also seen the horrific death of the young Polish worker Lukas Rosecko, a model worker and son beaten to death by a gang for a buzz. Can I also say, Concorda, we've also seen a disgraceful situation of a violent prisoner who was involved in the death of a Garda released to an open prison, and this again is a very, very serious situation, and the public are extremely angry. These deaths and threats are happening on our streets, and I'm glad the Minister for Justice is in here today. And there are many, many more unreported incidents. Yet there seems to be no widespread political revulsion. The silence is deafening. So, Minister, I would like to ask you today, first of all, will you join with me in paying tribute to Steve Collins and his family and the other victims for their bravery, their dignity and their sheer courage, as they have done this state some service? Secondly, if you are really serious about standing with them, can you outline to me how you and your government are going to protect our citizens? Do you realise, Minister, that many of our people are wondering who is actually running the country? Who is running the justice system in the state? And finally, can you tell this House, Minister, how you and your government are going to tackle these gangs and end lawlessness in this country?
Thank you, Deputy.
Thank you. Maybe I should begin by acknowledging Deputy McGrath's final day as leader of the technical group. I understand that he will be rotating out and handing over the baton to Deputy Pringle in the future. And I hope the trauma of the loss of leadership won't be too great for you to endure. But to deal with the very serious matter that Deputy McGrath has raised, I think that there is no right-thinking person in the country that doesn't acknowledge the debt that this state has to Mr. Collins and his family, who stood by the institutions of this state at great personal risk. And it is profoundly sad that he had to come to the conclusion that in order to live a normal life, that he had to move out of his home city. That is shocking, and I know that the Minister for Justice and this government has done everything to stand by Mr. Steve Collins and his families and support him in the decision that was best for himself and his family. In relation to the broader issue of gangland crime, the Deputy will be aware that the crime figures generally are significantly improved, that the actions of the Garda Síochána, particularly in Limerick, have ensured that probably the most pernicious and vicious gang that this country has ever had to encounter has been brought to heel, that many of them are in jail and that there are many more legal proceedings pending. So this is not to say that we should be complacent. We're not, because often thugs that end up in jail are replaced by the next generation of thugs. It's an ongoing battle, but I can assure the Deputy that in terms of the fight against particularly these pernicious gangs, that no resource will be spared.
Thank you. Deputy McGrath.
I just want to, first of all, thank the Minister for his comments in relation to me rotating in the technical group, and just to assure him that we have a group of very talented people in the technical group, and I wish them well in the future. Can I also thank the Minister, and I hope he takes on board my views in relation to the question they asked earlier on, because it does, I asked the Minister, it does make you wonder when you see the bravery and the integrity of somebody like Steve Collins and his family, and then you contrast that with the carry-on down the tribunals. I mean, that's what people are saying. People are saying that on the streets, and the whole integrity of it. But can I ask you further, Minister, do you accept now, though, that we need a new and radical strategy to deal with this violent gangland crime issue? And also, do you accept, Minister, that we need more prevention measures? There seems to be too much emphasis after the crime, after the murder, after the killings, and we need to have more prevention measures. Also, another very serious issue, which we all have a responsibility for, and the broader society. Will you accept that there's a major contact and a major reaction between the violence in the connection between cocaine and alcohol? Most of the Gardaí, A&E people, nurses, fire officers on the ground will tell you the people involved in mixing alcohol and cocaine are the extremely violent incidents, and they happen regularly every night in our communities. So what I'd say to you is, how is your government going to deal with the huge market out there for cocaine?
Thank you.
And finally, can I just say, just in relation to, I remember the late Tony Gregory, who raised this issue many, many times, and I think of him here today. But can I ask you, will you and your government sit down with the anti-drugs community groups, with the senior Gardaí, and develop a new strategy to try and tackle this issue over the next 2 or 3 months? Thank you, Concordia.
I think it is important that we acknowledge success too, and the Gardaí have been extremely vigilant and successful in relation to confronting the gangs in Limerick in particular. 106 gangland members are currently in jail, including 20 of the leaders of the gangs. And that's because of the hard, difficult task of following up the criminals and prosecuting them through the courts. And that process is ongoing. The Minister for Justice has already told this House that the very significant raft of legislation that exists currently is being reviewed constantly. And the views of the Garda Síochána, particularly the Commissioner, in relation to any resource or legislative measure that is required, will always be entertained by this Minister for Justice and by this government. In relation to the drugs issue generally, I think you're right. I think that we need to give a message across to those who use drugs, particularly the middle-class use of cocaine, that they are part of the gangland scene by providing a marketplace for this dangerous and destructive industry.
Thank you.